The sheriff's cruiser sat crooked in the gravel turnaround, its light bar throwing red and blue across the barnwood, and a woman in a cream blazer was screaming at a deputy half her age that this was still her jurisdiction, that she had signed papers, that none of this was legal, while 40 feet away, a man in a canvas jacket stood with his arms folded and said nothing at all, watching 3 decades of quiet patience arrive, finally, at its reckoning. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. What happened over the next 6 months in that valley would strip a woman of everything she had built on other people's land, and it started, strangely enough, with a fence post. His name was Walter Denholm, 61 years old, and the land he stood on that morning, 3,700 acres of high valley pasture, timber ridge, and a spring-fed creek that had never once run dry in living memory, had come to him the way it had come to his father before him and his grandfather before that, passed down not through inheritance lawyers and probate court but through a slow, unspoken agreement that some things simply belonged to a family because that family had earned them, acre by acre, season by season, since 1938. His grandfather, Elias Denholm, had homesteaded the original 600 acres after walking out of a coal town in West Virginia with nothing but a mule and a rifle, and had spent the better part of 2 decades clearing timber and diverting creek water by hand to grow the first crops the valley had ever seen. His father, Roy, had doubled the holding through the 50s and 60s, buying up adjoining parcels from neighbors who were leaving for factory work in the cities, and had taught Walter everything he knew about cattle, about soil, about the particular stubbornness required to make a living from land that did not forgive carelessness. Walter himself was a quiet man, the kind who wrote thank-you notes in pencil and waved at every car that passed on the county road whether he recognized it or not, and who had spent 40 years believing that a person's word, backed by a deed properly filed at the county recorder's office, was worth more than any argument a person could make with volume alone. The valley itself, before any of what follows, was about as close to self-sufficient as a working ranch could be. Walter ran 400 head of black Angus across the lower pastures, kept a 12-acre orchard of apple and pear trees that his mother had planted in 1962, and drew irrigation water from Cutter Creek under a water right that had been recorded, re-recorded, and confirmed by state survey 3 separate times since 1941. He sold hay to 5 ranches within 20 miles, kept his equipment maintained in a machine shed he'd built himself out of reclaimed barn lumber, and lived alone in the same farmhouse his grandfather had built, a half-mile up a gravel drive from the county road, with nothing around him but sky and grass and the particular silence that comes from land nobody has ever needed to argue over. There was no gate on the property. There had never needed to be one. The trouble began, as these things so often do, with a name Walter had never heard before a certified letter arrived in his mailbox. Renata Ashworth, self-titled president of the Cutter Creek Highlands Homeowners Association, an entity Walter did not recall joining, governing a subdivision he did not recall existing. The letter, dated the 14th of April, informed him that his property, described only as Lot 22 of the Cutter Creek Highlands Phase 3 development, was in violation of association bylaws regarding unauthorized livestock grazing, and that he had 30 days to bring the parcel into compliance or face daily fines beginning at $200. Walter read the letter twice at his kitchen table, checked it against a plat map that did not exist for any subdivision on his land, and concluded, reasonably, that someone had made an administrative error. He was not yet aware that Renata Ashworth was a woman with a laminated appearance, a talent for community theater, and a habit of describing herself at open houses as the visionary behind the most exclusive gated acreage community in 3 counties, a community that, as it would later become excruciatingly clear, existed almost entirely on marketing brochures and a website with drone footage of land Renata Ashworth had never once set foot on, let alone owned. She had, in fact, begun selling numbered lots within the boundaries of the Denholm family ranch 8 months earlier, using an old, long-expired subdivision filing from 1987 that a previous owner of an adjacent 40 acres had let lapse, and reselling parcels that overlapped Walter's recorded, continuously occupied, tax-paid land to buyers from 3 different states who believed, quite sincerely, that they had purchased a piece of mountain paradise with HOA-maintained roads, a community clubhouse, and this detail would matter enormously later, deeded water access to Cutter Creek. Walter did not know any of this yet. All he knew, standing in his kitchen with a certified letter in his hand, was that somebody named Renata Ashworth believed she had the authority to fine him for grazing cattle on land his grandfather had cleared with his own 2 hands, and that the polite thing to do, the Denholm thing to do, was to write back and clear up what was obviously a misunderstanding. That letter, calm and factual and photocopied for his own records before he sent it, was the first of what would eventually become a file 3 inches thick. The gravel crunched again beneath tires that Saturday morning in late April, and Walter looked up from mending a stretch of split-rail fence to see a woman he did not recognize standing at the edge of his own driveway with a clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield, informing him in a bright, rehearsed voice that she was conducting a compliance walkthrough on behalf of the Cutter Creek Highlands Homeowners Association and would need him to move his cattle away from what she called the common green space within the next 72 hours. Walter set down his fencing pliers, wiped his hands on his jeans, and asked her, politely, whether she had a survey or a deed that showed any common green space existing on his property, since he had lived there his entire life and had never heard of such a thing. The woman, later identified in Walter's growing file as Priya Nandan, a real estate agent Renata Ashworth had brought on to help move inventory in the Highlands development, did not have an answer for that, only a printed lot map with his grandfather's original barn circled in red marker and labeled, absurdly, as the future site of a clubhouse and fitness pavilion. Walter thanked her for her time, photographed the map she left behind, and added it to a manila folder he had started keeping in the top drawer of his father's roll-top desk, a folder that would, by the end of that summer, contain 41 dated pages. Weeks passed in this manner, each one arriving with some fresh, small absurdity that Walter met with the same unhurried calm his father had taught him to bring to a spooked horse, a letter demanding he remove unauthorized agricultural fencing that had stood since 1974, a notice fining him $300 for an unregistered outbuilding, which turned out to be the machine shed he'd built with his own hands in 2009, a phone call from a woman claiming to represent the association's Architectural Review Committee, asking why his farmhouse had not submitted paint color samples for approval. Walter answered every letter in writing, kept copies of everything he sent, and drove into town each time to have his responses notarized at the credit union, a habit that struck his neighbors as almost comically cautious until, much later, it would strike them as the only reason any of what followed could be proven at all. He never raised his voice on the phone. He never once drove to the little sales office Renata Ashworth had set up in a repurposed grain silo at the mouth of the valley to demand an explanation, though God knew he'd thought about it. Instead, he called the county recorder's office and requested a certified copy of every filing associated with the parcel numbers Renata Ashworth kept referencing, a request that would take 3 weeks to process and that Walter, being a patient man, simply set into motion and then went back to his fences. It was at the association's May general meeting, held in the community room of a bank 40 minutes down the highway, that things sharpened into something uglier than paperwork. Walter had received an invitation, his first, and it would turn out, his only one, inviting Lot 22 owner to attend and address concerns regarding non-compliance, and against his better judgment he went, thinking a room full of neighbors might be a reasonable place to finally clear the air. Renata Ashworth stood at the front of that room in a blazer the color of wet concrete and told a crowd of 40-some newly relocated homeowners, most of whom had paid deposits on lots that did not legally exist, that there was one difficult landowner who was refusing to cooperate with the community vision and grazing livestock illegally across shared amenity space, gesturing at a poster board rendering of a swimming pool and clubhouse that, as far as Walter could tell, had never been built and never would be, since it sat, according to the rendering's own coordinates, almost exactly on top of his mother's pear orchard. Walter stood up, asked calmly whether anyone in the room had actually seen a recorded plat map for Cutter Creek Highlands Phase 3, and was met with silence from an audience that had, understandably, no idea the ground beneath their new investment was built on a filing that had expired 11 years before any of them had signed a purchase agreement. Renata Ashworth called him combative in front of the entire room, said something about protecting the integrity of the community from bad actors, and Walter, feeling 40 pairs of eyes on him and understanding for the first time just how far this had already traveled, simply sat back down and let it pass, because he had learned a long time ago that a man who loses his temper in public loses the argument no matter how right he is. The real damage arrived 3 weeks later, and it was not the kind that could be smoothed over with a calmly worded letter. Walter drove out to check his upper irrigation line on a Tuesday morning and found the diversion gate on Cutter Creek, the gate his grandfather had installed by hand in 1951, the one governing a water right recorded with the state engineer's office under file number 4471C, had been forced open and rerouted with cinder blocks and plastic sheeting toward a construction site half a mile downstream, where a crew hired by Renata Ashworth's development company was pouring concrete footings for a model home she had begun advertising to prospective buyers. By the time Walter got the diversion repaired that afternoon, he had lost nearly 11 acres of first-cutting alfalfa to drought stress, a loss he calculated, with the help of his accountant 2 weeks later, at just over $18,000, and the machine shed's roof, he discovered that same evening, had a fresh, deliberate-looking tear in its northeast corner where someone had apparently attempted to run a survey stake through a support beam. This was no longer a misunderstanding between neighbors. This was money, and water, and a hole in his roof, and Walter Denholm decided, quietly, driving back to the farmhouse in the last light of that long Tuesday, that it was time to stop writing letters and start making phone calls to people whose job it was to read them. The attorney Walter called the following morning was a woman named Denise Okafor, who had handled land disputes and water rights cases out of a small storefront office in the county seat for nearly 20 years and who had, as it happened, represented Walter's father once in a boundary dispute back in the 90s. Walter drove in with the manila folder from his roll-top desk, now grown thick with dated letters, notarized responses, photographs of the forced diversion gate, and the crumpled architectural rendering Priya Nandan had left in his driveway, and spread it all across Denise's conference table while she read through it in silence, occasionally pausing to pull up county records on her laptop. It took her the better part of 2 hours to confirm what Walter had already begun to suspect, that the plat filing for Cutter Creek Highlands Phase 3 had lapsed in 2011 for failure to complete required infrastructure improvements, that the parcel numbers Renata Ashworth had been referencing in every letter and fine notice corresponded not to any legitimate subdivision but to land recorded continuously in the Denholm family name since a 1938 homestead patent, and that Walter's water right under File 4471C predated any claim Renata Ashworth's development company could possibly assert by more than 70 years. Denise leaned back in her chair, tapped the folder, and told him plainly that what he was looking at was not a zoning dispute but a case of an unlicensed developer selling fraudulent title to land she never owned, compounded now by trespass, property damage, and interference with a senior water right, and that if Walter was willing to be patient a while longer, they could build a case strong enough to end this permanently rather than just push back one letter at a time. Being patient, Walter had discovered, was the one skill this whole ordeal had never once required him to learn from scratch. Over the following 6 weeks, on Denise's careful instruction, he installed 2 weatherproof trail cameras along the creek line and the machine shed, purchased at her recommendation rather than his own initiative so that nothing about the surveillance could later be called retaliatory, and began keeping a handwritten log, time-stamped and countersigned by his neighbor Ovid Blackwell whenever possible, of every vehicle and every person who crossed onto the property without permission. The cameras caught more than Walter expected, a survey crew staking claims along the creek bank at 6 in the morning on a Thursday, well before any legal notice of entry had been filed, a pickup truck registered to Renata Ashworth's development company hauling fence posts toward the pear orchard on a weekend when no one was supposed to be on site at all, and, most damning of all, footage from the second week of June showing Renata Ashworth herself, in sunglasses and a sun hat, walking a group of 4 prospective buyers directly across Walter's hay field while gesturing toward his own farmhouse and describing it, on audio the camera's microphone picked up with startling clarity, as the future community clubhouse, currently being renovated. Denise had that clip enhanced and transcribed by a court-approved forensic technician within the week, and filed it, along with the Water District's own diversion records and a certified copy of the lapsed 2011 plat filing, as the foundation of a civil complaint for trespass, fraud, and interference with water rights, alongside a formal report to the state's real estate division regarding the sale of non-existent lots. Denise was careful to explain every step to Walter before he took it, since she knew, as he did, that a case built on righteous frustration alone would collapse the moment it met a courtroom. They did not confront Renata Ashworth directly. They did not post anything online, did not call a television station, did not so much as mention the lawsuit to a single neighbor, because Denise wanted the complaint served through the sheriff's office with zero warning, at a moment when Renata Ashworth would have no time to alter records or coach the buyers she'd been misleading. The complaint, along with a temporary restraining order barring any further construction activity or lot sales pending resolution, was filed on the second Monday of July and scheduled for service the following Thursday morning, timed deliberately, on Denise's advice, to coincide with a scheduled investor preview event Renata Ashworth had been advertising for weeks, a champagne and canapes walkthrough of the supposed clubhouse site, to which she had invited 11 prospective buyers and, Denise noted with some satisfaction, a reporter from the Regional Business Journal who covered real estate development. That Thursday morning arrived clear and warm, and Walter, at Denise's suggestion, simply stayed home and kept working his fences while a Cutter Creek County Sheriff's deputy named Marcus Whitfield drove out to serve the papers at the exact moment Renata Ashworth stood in front of 11 strangers gesturing toward the machine shed roof and describing granite countertops that did not exist. What happened next, according to 3 separate witnesses and the deputy's own report, was that Renata Ashworth's carefully rehearsed pitch dissolved within about 90 seconds of the deputy's arrival, as she alternated between insisting the deputy had the wrong address, that this was clearly a mistake, and that whoever had filed this complaint was going to regret it, all while 11 prospective buyers stood frozen with half-eaten canapés in their hands, slowly beginning to understand that the clubhouse, the pool, the deeded water access, and quite possibly the very ground beneath their feet, might not belong to anyone they had ever spoken with. It was at that moment, with red and blue lights sweeping across the same barnwood his grandfather had nailed up in 1951, that Walter finally drove down from the upper pasture in his truck, arms folded, saying nothing, watching 30 years of quiet patience arrive at last at its reckoning, exactly as it had appeared at the very beginning of this story. Deputy Whitfield, a calm, unhurried man in his mid-40s who had worked Cutter Creek County for 18 years and had a reputation for never raising his voice no matter who was raising theirs at him, separated the two parties without ceremony, took Walter's statement first since Walter was, notably, the only person present holding a folder of dated, notarized documentation, and then turned to Renata Ashworth and began asking the kind of plain, specific questions that tend to unravel a story. Built on confidence rather than fact, which recorder's office had approved the current plat map, what document number governed the water rights she'd been advertising, and whether she could produce a single deed showing her company held title to the land beneath the model home currently under construction. Renata Ashworth's answers grew looser and more contradictory with each question, and somewhere in the middle distance, one of the 11 prospective buyers could be heard quietly asking her real estate agent whether she thought they could still get their deposit back. The state's real estate division assigned an investigator named Priscilla Yoon to the fraud complaint within 2 weeks, and Yoon, a methodical woman who had spent 11 years untangling exactly this kind of scheme across 3 different counties, brought in a licensed land surveyor named Gordon Ashby to conduct an independent boundary survey of the entire Cutter Creek Highlands footprint before the case advanced any further. Ashby spent 4 days walking the property with a total station and a set of county monuments dating back to the original 1938 homestead patent, and what he found, laid out in a 22-page report delivered to both Denise Okafor and the real estate division, went well beyond simply confirming what Walter had already suspected. Not one of the 41 lots Renata Ashworth had sold over the previous 8 months fell entirely within the boundaries of the lapsed 2011 filing, and 18 of them, including the model home site and the Phantom Clubhouse, sat entirely on Denholm family land that had never, at any point in its recorded history, been part of any subdivision application at all. More damning still, Ashby's report noted a discrepancy in the elevation benchmarks Renata Ashworth's marketing materials had used to advertise unobstructed valley views from lots that, according to his instruments, did not physically exist as buildable ground, since the coordinates given placed several of them on a 40-degree slope above Cutter Creek that no engineer would ever approve for residential construction. Ashby, a plain-spoken man not given to editorializing, wrote in his summary only that the marketing materials appeared to describe a development that has no basis in the surveyed topography, a sentence that Denise would later read aloud in full during pre-trial proceedings to considerable effect. It was Priscilla Yoon's financial subpoena, issued to the escrow company Renata Ashworth's development entity had used to process buyer deposits, that finally exposed the full shape of what had been happening in that valley for the better part of a year. The record showed that Renata Ashworth had collected just over $640,000 in deposits and reservation fees from 41 buyers across 3 states, and that rather than holding those funds in the escrow account her own sales contracts promised, she had transferred the overwhelming majority of it into a personal account and a separate LLC registered to her husband, using roughly $200,000 of it to purchase a lake house 80 miles away, a fact that would have remained invisible had you not cross-referenced the LLC's formation date with the timing of the very first fraudulent lot sale. Buried in that same subpoena were internal emails between Renata Ashworth and Priya Nandan, obtained under a separate warrant once the fraud investigation formally opened, in which Renata Ashworth had written, 11 months earlier, that the existing rancher on the property was too passive to cause real problems and that they should move fast on pre-sales before he figures out what's happening, language that made unmistakably clear this had never been a genuine misunderstanding about shared amenity space, but a calculated bet that a quiet man would stay quiet forever. Word of the fraud investigation moved through the valley the way water moves downhill, slowly at first and then all at once, and the shift in how Walter's neighbors spoke of him was almost startling in its speed. Ovid Blackwell, who had spent the spring quietly signing Walter's handwritten logs without ever saying much about the letters piling up at the Denholm place, was the first to say out loud at the feed store what several others had apparently been thinking for weeks, that Renata Ashworth had tried the same compliance letters on two other longtime landowners along the county road before Walter, and that both of them had simply paid small fines rather than fight it, assuming, as most reasonable people do, that an official-looking letter from an association must carry some legal weight. A retired schoolteacher named Constance Ferrer, who had bought one of the fraudulent lots in good faith and had already put down a full deposit toward the clubhouse membership fee, drove out to the Denholm Ranch unannounced one Saturday, not to accuse Walter of anything, but to apologize for having believed, even briefly, that his hay field was common green space, and to ask, quietly, whether he thought there was any chance she'd see her deposit again. By the time the criminal fraud charges were formally filed that August, alongside Denise's civil complaint, there was not a single voice left in Cutter Creek County willing to describe Renata Ashworth as anything other than what the state's own investigator had, by then, called her in writing, an unlicensed developer who had built an entire sales operation on land she never owned. The trial, when it finally opened in October before Judge Miriam Castellano in the county courthouse, ran across 4 days and drew a courtroom gallery that included, by the second morning, most of the 41 defrauded buyers, several of Walter's neighbors, and the same regional Business Journal reporter who had been standing at the champagne table with a canopy in her hand the morning the deputy arrived. Denise built her case methodically and without theatrics, walking the jury first through the 1938 homestead patent and the unbroken chain of recorded title down to Walter, then through Gordon Ashby's survey establishing that the sold lots overlapped Denholm land entirely, then through Priscilla Yoon's financial records showing the escrow diversions and the lake house purchase, and finally through the internal emails describing Walter as too passive to cause problems, a phrase Denise had blown up onto a courtroom display screen and left on the projector for nearly a full minute of silence before continuing. Renata Ashworth testified in her own defense on the third day, insisting under oath that she had genuinely believed the 2011 filing remained active and that any overlap with Walter's land was an honest surveying error on someone else's part. But her account began to fracture under Denise's cross-examination the moment she was asked to explain why her own marketing brochures listed elevation figures that Gordon Ashby's report showed corresponded to a slope no licensed engineer had ever certified as buildable, and why, if this had all been an honest mistake, she had personally walked prospective buyers across Walter's working hay field and described his machine shed as a clubhouse under renovation on camera. Judge Castellano, delivering her ruling from the bench late on the fourth afternoon, spoke for nearly 20 minutes without notes, stating plainly for the record that the evidence showed not a mistaken belief in the scope of a lapsed filing, but a deliberate and sustained pattern of selling title the defendant knew, or with the most basic diligence should have known, she did not possess, and that the diversion of buyer escrow funds toward personal property removes any remaining question of good faith from this proceeding. Judge Castellano's ruling closed with a judgment that stunned even Denise with its scope. Renata Ashworth was ordered to pay Walter $18,400 in direct damages for the destroyed alfalfa crop and the forced diversion of Cutter Creek, an additional sum covering the machine shed repairs and Denise's legal fees, and, separately, restitution to the 41 defrauded buyers totaling the full $640,000 collected in deposits, to be satisfied. First through forfeiture of the lake house her husband's LLC had purchased and then through a court-ordered payment plan against her remaining assets. The criminal fraud charges, tried separately before a jury in November, returned a guilty verdict on all 6 counts, and Renata Ashworth was sentenced to 18 months, with the judge in that proceeding noting for the record that a suspended sentence would send exactly the wrong message to anyone considering selling land they did not own to people who had no way of knowing better. She was permanently barred by the state's real estate division from holding a broker's license or forming any future real estate development entity within the state, a detail that made the regional Business Journal's front page under a headline Walter never bothered to read, since by then he had stopped checking the newspaper for his own name entirely and gone back to fixing the tear in his machine shed roof. The fallout moved through Cutter Creek Highlands with the same speed the fraud investigation had, only now in the opposite direction. The handful of residents who had actually closed on legitimate lots within the still valid portion of the old development, 6 households, as it turned out, whose parcels genuinely had fallen inside boundaries that predated the 2011 lapse, organized within weeks to dissolve the existing association entirely and petition the county to establish a smaller, properly filed road maintenance district in its place, a petition that carried unanimous support once word spread of exactly how the previous association had been run. Constance Ferrer, the retired schoolteacher who had driven out to apologize to Walter that Saturday in August, was elected the new district's first administrator that winter, and one of her earliest official acts was to send Walter a short, formally worded letter of apology on the district's letterhead, acknowledging that he had been wrongly targeted, harassed, and financially harmed by the prior association's leadership, and expressing regret on behalf of residents who had, however, unwittingly, lent legitimacy to a fraud simply by living beside it. Walter kept that letter. He did not keep it in the manila folder with everything else, but folded separately in his father's rolltop desk, in the drawer where he also kept his grandfather's original 1938 patent, because it seemed to him the kind of thing that belonged with the family's other proof that the land had always, in the end, been exactly what it claimed to be. By the following spring, the diversion gate on Cutter Creek had been fully repaired and reinforced with a new steel housing. Walter installed himself over 3 long Saturdays. The 11 acres of alfalfa that had gone dry the previous June had come back thick and green under a full season of unbroken irrigation, and the tear in the machine shed roof was patched so cleanly that Walter sometimes forgot, walking past it on ordinary mornings, that it had ever needed patching at all. The construction crew's abandoned concrete footings for the Phantom model home were broken up and hauled off that April at the new district's expense, and the ground beneath them, once cleared, turned out to sit almost exactly where his mother had always talked about extending the pear orchard, so Walter planted 11 new trees there in May, a small, unhurried decision that felt to him less like reclaiming something than like simply continuing what had always been underway before anyone interrupted it. Cattle grazed the lower pastures again without a single letter arriving to question it. The gravel drive stayed quiet. The valley, in other words, went back to being exactly what it had been before any of this started, which was the only outcome Walter had ever actually wanted, since he had never once, through all of it, been chasing anything so grand as vindication. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over land once trouble has finally passed through it and moved on, different from the ordinary quiet that was there before, carrying underneath it the faint memory of everything the ground has witnessed. And Walter Denholm, standing at the edge of his mother's expanded orchard on a September evening 2 years after that first certified letter arrived in his mailbox, found himself thinking less about Renata Ashworth or courtrooms or survey stakes than about his grandfather walking out of a coal town with a mule and a rifle and nothing else, and about how strange it was that the same patience which had once cleared this valley by hand was the very thing that had, decades later, saved it. He thought about his father, too, who had never in his life raised his voice at another man and had somehow still built a ranch that outlasted every person who ever doubted it could. Walter had no children to pass the land to, not yet, though he had begun, quietly, to imagine what he might say to whoever eventually stood where he was standing now, some version of himself 2 generations further down the line, wondering whether the ground beneath their boots had always simply belonged to them or whether someone, once, had needed to prove it. The creek ran on below him, exactly where it had always run, indifferent to lawsuits and letters and lake houses bought with other people's deposits, carrying water down through pasture his grandfather cleared, past a machine shed his own hands had built and rebuilt, toward a valley that had never once needed defending so much as it needed someone patient enough to wait for the truth to catch up to it. Land remembers who tended it, long after it forgets who only ever tried to sell it.